All right, Randy, I invite you now to introduce yourself, tell everybody who you are, what you're doing, and what we're going to talk about today.
Well, thanks, Dan. I really do appreciate the invite, and it is an honor to be on this demonstration with you, or this presentation with you. And I see just a lot of people from all across the world that have joined in. So thanks to everybody for joining in, and really appreciate your time to learn a little bit about toxic leadership, which is something that has really been an important part of my life, which is why I selected to really look into toxic leadership when I was doing my doctorate at USC. And so I just hope to continue to do that. And one of the things that I really like about toxic leadership is that it kind of tells you what not to do. And so often in leadership training, leadership books, if you listen to Simon Sinek, love Simon Sinek, but they're always telling you these are the things that you should do. You should be empathetic. You should, lead by example, and all these different best practices of leadership. But rarely do we really talk about what are the dark side of leadership, and what to avoid in the dark side of leadership. And so that's really what I would like to kind of chat with you about, Dan, and talk about some of the statistics and some of the examples that are out there that really show what toxic leadership is. A little bit about me. Currently, my main job is in NEOM in Saudi Arabia. It's a new futuristic city that Saudi Arabia is building. We're not going to talk about NEOM at all. I haven't, I don't have any examples of NEOM, and I haven't cleared any public communications with the NEOM communications department, so I'm not even allowed to talk about NEOM. But it's a great mission that they're doing there, and it's really driving change. And in fact, their motto is "Made to Change." And so I'd encourage everybody to go to neom, neom.com, and just check that out. But that's kind of my main job. I also am an adjunct associate professor at USC. I just started there, so I'm excited about having my first class in emergency management in their online master's program there. And then, as you know, Dan, we have a couple of nonprofits that I'm involved with. One of which is the new Foundation for the Research and Advancement of Emergency Management. That's FRAME, spelled wrong, FRAEM.org. And would encourage people to check that out and what we're trying to do there, as well as the other nonprofit that I'm involved with is the All Hazards Incident Management Teams Association. And I've been involved with them since the beginning, way back in 2010, and I'm the president of that association. So would encourage people to look into that if you're really into incident command, incident management, and the use of teams for that. So doing a lot there. My background in emergency management really spans a long distance, from getting its start in emergency management in Indiana at the state level, and then I went to the local level with the city of Indianapolis, and then back to the state before I had a little manifest destiny and headed west to California. And in California, I did several different things, one of which was with Southern California Edison as a specialist in emergency management. Another was as the national director of American Humane Animal Rescue, an amazing organization that rescues animals during disasters. And so if you're an animal lover, I would encourage you to check them out and donate there because they do a great job at rescuing animals during disaster. And then I was with the city of El Segundo, all during my time while I was getting my advanced degrees. And I was the emergency management specialist with them. And then in terms of my education, I got my executive master of leadership from University of Southern California back in 2015, or I started in 2015, and then moved and transitioned right into the doctorate program in organizational change and leadership out of their Rossier School of Education there. And again, I selected those things because I really have had a passion for leadership that had been instilled in me from a young age. probably long even before the Marine Corps. But in the Marine Corps, of course, you're getting pounded with all kinds of leadership training there throughout your career. And then coming out of that has always just been a passion. And then there's a lot of leadership training and emergency management that we take. And so have always just continued to hone my skills through training, do a lot of reading, and like I said, it's just a passion. And so I'm just really excited to be here and talk about toxic leadership with everybody today. And I really believe that this is a topic not specific to emergency management. Every organization, nonprofit, private sector, public sector, government, emergency management, police, fire, EMS, you name it, and leadership and toxic leadership specifically affects those organizations in a very significant way. And in fact, I'd really like to, I think all of the participants here on the call can show, either by clapping or thumbs up or whatever on the emoji icons or whatever, if you've ever had a bad boss or ever been involved in a toxic leadership situation in your work life, just let us know by showing us those thumbs up or those wave signs or whatever.
Yeah, they're lighting up right now, so it's definitely everybody's experienced it at some level, I believe. And Randy, I think one of our shared passions other than emergency management is leadership. We obviously come at it from different points of view, but I think that your point of view on leadership as it is viewed through the toxic leadership frame or lens is very interesting, and the work that you've done on it, more so the information that you have to share regarding the importance of understanding toxic leadership and then avoiding it is really important. So overall, the topic of toxic leadership, what makes it so important?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. And I mean, it's really a run-on sentence when it comes to it, because there's just so many impacts, and even the impacts on myself when I've been in those types of situations. And I try to be as self-aware as I can and understand how I'm either giving or not giving back to the organization that I may be working for that's in a toxic situation. And I notice personally my own performance degrades from that, and I can't, the only thing that it does by experiencing it day in and day out is my desire to get on LinkedIn and find another job. And I'd say that might be one of the top effects that toxic leadership has on an organization, and that's a high employee turnover. And if you look at some of the studies, about 58% of the employees that leave their job is because of poor management and just a culture that they don't like being in. And so that's a huge number of people to be losing. And then when you think about the impacts of that kind of turnover on an organization, and you got to think that there's an estimate, I think it's by a Gallup poll, which is or a Gallup report anyway, that over about 150% of departing employees' salary is lost because of what you have to bring back in. So if you lose an employee and you have to basically find another employee and they have to start learning that institutional knowledge of that organization, you're going to lose 150% of that employee's salary. So there's a huge money loss there every time you lose an employee. And quite frankly, when you're doing that, you're losing all kinds of productivity, obviously. So that's one huge reason. Another reason is as I mentioned before, the decreased employee engagement. And studies will show that only about 15% of employees are engaged at work under a toxic leadership environment. So if you have 100 employees in a toxic leadership environment, you're getting maybe the best work out of 15 people. That's amazing amount of production that your organization is missing out on simply because there's animosity toward that organization. And so they're not going that extra mile, and they're not willing to do the things that in an otherwise good, healthy leadership environment would provide. And so when you're losing, not only do you lose their interest and their engagement, but a lot of times that animosity will turn over into almost retaliation from the employees to the employer. I mean, you see all the time a lot of people that may go to the press and talk about how bad the organization is, or they're going to go on to the web, on social media, or on places like Glassdoor or Indeed or LinkedIn and talk negatively about your organization. And now we're diving into that more organizational reputation environment. And so that's going to make it even harder to attract new employees too. So now you're not going to be getting the benefit of good recruits, because they're seeing, hey, there's a negative work environment there that I don't want to be involved in. And so they end up not kind of applying for those positions or whatever. I think toxic leadership environment would also, I know it does, it increases employee absenteeism, although I kind of lump that in with the lack of engagement, because if you're not engaged, it's certainly a lot easier to wake up in the morning and go, I really don't want to deal with my boss today. And, then they call in sick, and now you have absenteeism. So now you're losing loss of work time and so forth. I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that is the healthcare costs that are associated with toxic leadership. A lot of times we think about, some of the other consequences of toxic leadership, but these toxic leadership can cause both emotional or mental issues as well as physical issues. Very well documented in the research, and when that happens, of course, what's happening? Healthcare costs are going up, and so now all of a sudden it's a lot more money for your organization to operate. So there's a huge damage to the organization in regards to that. And then when you don't have your engaged employees, you're also going to suffer from a reduced amount of innovation. And the studies will show that innovation drops by 33% in environments that are not physically safe for people to bring up new ideas or to, talk about some of the problems that need to be resolved and that sort of thing, because they just don't think that there's any point to it, or they have no, esprit de corps for their organization because of the toxicity, and they just let things slide all day long. So there's things like that. The obvious things could be sexual harassment and other legal issues that could come up, which is going to burden the organization, of course. And so overall, we're talking damage to the employee, damage to the organization, damage and higher cost to the organization. And these are significant impacts on the organization. And overall, across the country, some of the studies indicate that this toxic leadership really costs U.S. organizations, companies, $450 to $550 billion. That's billion with a B, and that's a huge impact that obviously is something that we should be paying attention to. And I personally believe we basically have a pandemic of toxic leadership out there that goes unchecked, and so it really does affect every organization.
Well, I appreciate your, when you're talking about, people leaving, organization, and there's so many things that go in accordance with that too. I mean, when you think about it, you see it all the time, right? People don't leave their jobs; they leave their leadership or their management, or when I think about that too, because we utilize the word leadership, right? Just because that they might be in leadership or a boss, they're not a leader. So, but there's also that level too that people leave because of the environment, and go along with those health costs that you mentioned. There's mental health illness and mental health issues, and and other concerns are on the rise, and there's not as much of a stigma attached to that as there used to be, but there's still one of those things that if you're going to work every day and you're unhappy and you could be making yourself physically sick, you're obviously also emotionally and mentally having issues as well, because you don't know what you're going to experience. You don't know if you're walking into someone in a good mood, in a bad mood, if you never know if they're, or if they're always in a bad mood. You never know if you're going to be the target that day, or you might be walking into an environment where you are the target. That's just you go into work and you're basically that brings down to, I know you want to talk about some legality that goes along with toxic workshop, but that harassment part of it, or that that toxic work environment, right? That people, I had to go and deal with this, and there's emotional, and you got people suing you and all these other things, right? So I love some of the statistics you pointed, but that people losing, or businesses losing, I should say, this much money as it relates to having to replace people, or having to retrain, or just because customer service goes down because you don't have enough people to deal with them. It's like a chain reaction. So let's talk about that a little bit, and how that affects the business or organization. It could be for profit, non-profit. Either way, it affects the organization's health, and it affects the organization's cash flow or finances at a level. But more than that, the resources, which is the people, right? So let's talk about that in some of the studies that you've discovered there.
Yeah, I mean, it really is, as you mentioned, a downward spiral. One thing affects the other, and then it just continues to compound in terms of the problems that it presents to the organization and to the people. And quite frankly, when we're talking about leadership, we're talking about the people. And I think in the Marine Corps, they beat it into you. Mission accomplishment first, and then troop welfare next. But in the civilian world, it's a lot different. And I think we need to we really should be focusing on that welfare of our employees, and ensure that we're really tuned in to what those employees are experiencing in their organizations, because a lot of times the toxic leadership isn't even observed. In many organizations, it has become almost routine because it is just so prevalent throughout the organization that most people don't even know it's a toxic leadership environment. And only the people that know are either the new people that come in and are getting some sort of culture shock as to how this organization is running. And they're the ones with the fresh eyes going, this is crazy, that this person is a bully, or that person is a narcissist, or that things are driven by the focus of abuse and fear. And certainly that's not the way to manage an organization, and you're not going to get the best response out of your people. And I think a leader is going to really start focusing on how to get the most out of their people, and it's by investing in those individuals and caring for those individuals and making those individuals feel safe and and there needs to be a trust atmosphere all across the organization. And if there's not trust, then all there is backstabbing and office politics, and it just compounds itself because now all of a sudden you have people that are at each other's throats and doing kind of things that each one doesn't like. And again, it just infects the entire organization from that aspect.
Well, and I appreciate that, very much too, because a lot of it too, especially when you're dealing with an environment, you don't know how far it goes. Is it departmental? Is it organizational? Is it individual?
Yeah.
Right. And, it varies, but, ultimately, how the organization deals with it versus department deals with it versus how you deal with it as an individual. I know that all plays a role, and it ultimately plays a role based on the individual and how much they're willing to overcome or deal with or not deal with, right? If it's bad, I'm leaving, right? Or if it's great, I'm staying. Doesn't matter how, it's not always about the money, right? And we've found, especially in emergency management, there's not a lot of that proactivity part of things as far as leadership goes, because it's so all over the place, right? Because we got small, we got departments of one, and you got departments of 20, and you got organizations that don't have it at all. So that level of trying to be that proactive leader and lead in all directions can turn toxic, even if it wasn't before. So what is your definition in all the research you did in your writing? What is toxic leadership defined as?
Well, there's not one universally accepted definition of toxic leadership. And you can look at all the different studies, and each study probably outlines what they're talking about when they're talking about toxic leadership or destructive leadership. They all have, a lot of the same. They have a lot of the same intention behind it. They have a lot of the same characteristics and behaviors behind it. I mean, you can go anywhere from abusive or bullying activity from a boss to destructive, narcissistic, controlling, and micromanagement. All of that would fall into that. And those are some of the easier ones. Those are some of the easier ones to kind of identify. But there's also a more tacit aspect of leadership too, even just tolerance of poor leadership skills from a manager or supervisor or whatever is toxic in and of itself. So if you're tolerating it, then and there's a saying, that which is tolerated is encouraged, and that which is encouraged grows. And so that's what you're going to see in there. So even just letting things go that you're not addressing, or even some kinds of things like favoritism, that's toxic. Looking at some of those things, you can look at all the definitions, and again, they're all going to be really close to one another in terms of what they are. But I think we all just kind of recognize that toxic leadership is that which either harms the employee or harms the organization. And let's just kind of boil it down to those kinds of things. And then that's where we need to stop doing those activities and make sure that we're taking care of our employees and doing what we need to do to achieve the mission of the organization, but doing so in accordance with our values of the organization. Because a lot of times, as an example, you saw this with the Rampart scandal out of LAPD in the 1990s. You had these police officers in their crash unit, which were, really fighting those really tough gangs. But they started using a lot more less than ethical, shall we say, behaviors to try to combat hatred with hatred or crime with crime, if you will. And that became very toxic, and obviously not in alignment with what LAPD wanted in terms of their values. But it just became, hey, we're being effective. We're planting evidence, so we're getting this known criminal off the street and so forth. And that's not a good thing. We need, ethical behavior is a part of the healthy side of leadership, and unethical behavior is part of that toxic leadership. And so that LAPD Rampart scandal really ended up in bad things for LAPD. 70 officers lost. That's 70 officers that they have to replace. Think of the money and the impact on that, on top of the reputational impact on the organization, on top of all the legal fees from all the lawsuits, and then all the criminals that got to go free because there was, basically a doubt as to whether they were really guilty or not because of it. So that's a prime example of how leadership just went off the rails there, and they thought they were doing something good. And I have every belief that every police officer that was involved in that scandal got into the police service for reasons of good, and just ended up in a toxic leadership environment that spiraled out of control.
Yeah, that when you're talking about that, one thing that is that you kind of adapt to your environment, right? So if it's around, you might start to adapt or take on some of those toxic traits, whether intentional or unintentional.
Right.
Either way, it's still happening, and taking a little bit of an ethical break here or a moral break there can actually have compounding results later as it relates to organization. And I know that you know, you had mentioned previous about productivity, and you know, one of the most recent studies shows that, you know, in a typical 8-hour day, people are productive about 6 of those. So when you think about bathroom breaks and you know, water cooler discussions and phone calls or browsing online, you know, so you got about 6 hours, and I think that's being generous
Right.
today. But when you're in a place where you just don't care, when you have no passion, no desire to do your work because you just don't care anymore, that productivity goes down, you know, even more. So, you know, how much work you're actually getting done, you're maybe even doing the bare minimums, if that. You're seeing how long you get away with not doing the work that you're supposed to be doing. But you've described it in such a way, you had a comparison on how it's a virus. You know, I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit, because I think it's a great comparison, because viruses spread. You know, they're contagious. Your attitude, I literally have it on my wall right in front of me, that attitudes are contagious, make yours worth catching.
Yeah.
So like that, you know, you can catch it good or bad. I mean, the proximity you find yourself in with somebody, if they're in a negative place, you could seriously become in a negative place if you're not monitoring that. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do think that's a great analogy, because it does have some tentacles that really just branch out. And, you know, and, you know, every organization is different. And as you mentioned, you know, it could just be a department or an office of an organization, or it could be the entire organization as a whole, starting from, you know, the CEO or whatever C-suite level person there is on down. And let's also be honest, one thing that we have to pay attention to is that every single one of us, when it comes to leadership, carries a leadership or a toxic leadership trait. We're carriers of the gene, if you will. And what leadership is all about is trying every day in and day out, to be the best leader that we can be. And every one of us fails at that, you know, and sometimes we have good days and sometimes we have bad days. But the good leaders are going to be the ones that recognize that they do have that gene, and that we have to constantly be on the lookout for those toxic leadership behaviors and not do them. And the minute that we stop paying attention to who we are and how we're coming across to the people that we're leading, that's when it starts to really come off the rails and starts to be communicable, as you mentioned. And so when we look at that communicable disease aspect of toxic leadership, a couple of things are going to happen. One is some of the subordinates to that toxic leader are going to jump on the toxic leadership bandwagon, and they're going to think that behavior is happening and it's being tolerated. That means I can do it too. And so they're just going to mirror that. And so that's going to, again, affect more people, especially if those are, you know, if it's an upper middle management to a middle management, now it's going down to the frontline supervisors or frontline people or whatever. And so now it's really infecting all of those individuals. And if it's not them picking up that, or if it's not those people communicating that toxic leadership disease, then it's the other people that are being the victims of that, and they're really getting they're catching the cold, if you will, and they're having all the symptoms of the stress and the low productivity and the I'm looking for another job and I'm quitting and so forth. So you know, I really do think that that's a great analogy as to how toxic leadership works and how it can totally affect an entire organization. And if you do toxic leadership math, if you have, you know, one manager of some sort and they have 8 employees, one toxic leader will infect, you know, about 50% of those people. And then now 8 employees are getting the productivity of 4 employees. Well, you might as well just, you know, hire part-time employees or something. So, you know, and save some money there or whatever. But it really does have that huge impact all the way down throughout the tentacles of an organization.
You know, that for me, that kind of resembles what I try and, you know, talk about and write about, and is the purposeful and intentional, you know, mindset, and the attitude that goes along with that. But when it comes to leadership, or let's just say when it comes to people in general, it's like almost natural for us to go more towards the negative than to the positive. And I still, I mean, all the research, all the reading, all the writing, all the, listening that I've done, nobody knows why that happens, but that's just, if it's negative, that's where our attention goes. I mean, think about, what you're looking at on social media, or what you're looking at on the news. It's all negative, and it draws our attention because we want, for whatever reason. But it's so easy, that mob mentality too, to kind of jump in there, and you kind of go with what's going on around you. And you got to be very intentional with purpose to really understand, have that situational and self-awareness to know, like, okay, what's going on? Am I contributing? Am I not? What can I do to help fix it? What can I do to step away from it? Am I engaging? Am I promoting? All that good stuff that goes along with you being a good leader, but more than that, a good person. So when it comes to, the environment is how it's built, it really is an intentional thing to go away from that type of thing. So how do you see it when you do have an organization? I mean, if it's organizational, I mean, you're looking at the potential death of an organization if you don't start taking the medicine of the proper leadership and doing the proper things and having the proper priorities. How does that affect an individual on that level to, like, contribute to that? As you said, it's a virus. So a virus can kill you, or it can get you sick, take its course, and then you're immune to it. But there's so many different things. So tell me how that kind of relates. And I love the analogy.
Yeah, well, and yes, and that's where we get into, what we talked about a little bit earlier, which was, the impact to the individual can be incredible. And actually was just recently talking to a colleague, and that which happens at work, especially in a toxic environment, which is causing the employees so much stress and so much heartache and so much concern. All they're thinking about is survival, really, and what they need to make the paycheck, and they need to care for their kids and their family and their wives and their husbands and their everybody that's involved with that's tied to basically them having secure employment and so forth. And so they're really, when they're at work, they're worried about what's going on at home. And then when they get home, they're angry, they're upset. It can create marital issues. It can create, as we said before, mental issues and concerns. There's, now you're going to have to take some time off to go to therapy, or you're going to have to have other issues addressed. And it can even be, you can really even experience physical trauma to your body in dealing with it, because you could, lack of sleep as an example. And when you start having lack of sleep, now you're not thinking clearly. So we talk about the downward spiral with the organization, but there's a downward spiral with the individual too in toxic leadership, because they really are trying to manage the stress at work. It creates stress at home. And so now they're trying to, resolve the issues at home that may, they're not going to be these sole issues with regards to maybe the stress on a marriage or the stress on a relationship between a parent and children and that sort of thing. But it's a contributing factor for sure. And that, that's not what we want out of our organizations. Our organizations need to be focused on keeping the stress as low as possible, and any overspill of the work stress off of the family and off of the personal life. We want that good personal work-life balance kind of thing.
So ultimately, we've talked about the bad stuff, right? We talked about what it can do, how it can affect people. So how do we overcome it? How is it that, I know you've listed out several defenses that are great to keep in mind. I want everybody on the call to really understand, if they're in that environment or they sense that environment, things that they can do to defend themselves against that type of stuff.
Yeah. Well, from an organizational standpoint, I think the first line of defense is establishing and abiding by those core values that I mentioned. And so often you see in these organizations, they have these core values and their strategic plans and everything else. They may even do some training on it, require annual training and so forth, but that's kind of where it ends. And they don't really walk the walk and talk the talk, and they don't live by those values. But that's where you really need to, there's a reason that they're there, and there's a reason that they're a part of best business practices, but it's not a best business practice unless you're actually abiding by those organizations or by those values and living by them. And so, instead of just being words on a paper and a strategic plan or on a website someplace or whatever, you really need to live those values. And when you're hiring new people, you need to be pursuing those people that also, have those values. And so often, where you do interviews or you do an application process, you're not even really evaluating, is this person somebody that is really capable of and fits well with the organization and the values that we have. So I think that's the first line of defense right there. And then the second line of defense is guarding the front door. Because once you've kind of cleaned house and you have the team that you need, the healthy leadership environment that you need, the last thing you need is an infected person, going back to the communicable disease analogy, coming in and starting to spread that. So, controlling that front door is key to keeping the toxic leadership out. And, you start that, and, this is a lot of what I did in my dissertation. So you start that, and the first thing you need to do is you look at the job descriptions. And oh my gosh, some of these job descriptions in these organizations have, they never get updated. And oftentimes they're very technical in nature. We're looking for, somebody who can use Word or somebody who can type X amount of words a minute or whatever the case may be, but never does it really talk about the leadership traits that they want in somebody in a position. And I'm assuming that most organizations want leaders in management positions. And so, but you need to update those job descriptions to reflect that. And then when you're doing the job search, you're looking for the people that mirror those leadership traits that you're looking for. And then the second thing that we do that is wrong is we really rely on interviews. So many of the processes to hiring is just about coming in and seeing maybe the HR person first, and then the second is maybe the hiring manager, and maybe even a third interview with the next manager up kind of thing. And everybody goes, oh yeah, I really like that person. And then you hire this person, and a year later you find out what a toxic leader it is. And let's be real. A lot of people liked Hitler in 1930, and so you got to avoid that as much as you can. Interviews are not the way to select individuals and their qualifications. And quite frankly, if you're trying to monitor that front door or keep that toxic leader out of your organization, another way to do it is incorporate psychological testing. And psychological testing can focus on personality traits and leadership traits, and also flag for narcissism and micromanagement, a lack of empathy, and that sort of thing. So if you can use and incorporate those pieces into your hiring process, and certainly you still have to do interviews, but just don't give the interview as so much weight. But a lot of us, I think we ultimately just rely on our own opinions about how we respond to somebody or how we feel about somebody. But that's not, especially in a 30-minute, 1-hour interview, you're not going to get to know the person. And remember, that person is putting their best foot forward. And what's going to show up later is their worst foot. So if we can kind of tweak the HR process and the application and the hiring process, incorporate some psychological testing in there, I think that's important. And then the third defense is to toxic leadership is the mentorship and monitoring. And this is where accountability becomes so important to each other. And you need to be able to have that relationship, maybe not with everybody at your organization, although there might be some good argument for having an open door kind of thing where each person can hold each other accountable, but at least have some accountability partners kind of thing or whatever that says, hey, I saw how you treated that other employee over there, and that wasn't right, and we need to rectify that situation, kind of thing. And so there's the monitoring there, mentoring from other leaders to the maybe newer staff and that sort of thing, as well as hire a coach. if it's not just you as the director or C-suite manager, whatever, hiring your own personal coach, but hiring a firm or a coach to represent and be able to meet with all the different employees of the organization. And, you can have little office hours times to kind of reflect and talk about leadership principles or leadership actions or challenges or things that the employees are experiencing, and kind of talk through those. So you're always remaining aware. And as I mentioned before, the minute you stop focusing on that self-awareness, you're going to lose the battle in terms of keeping toxic leadership out of the organization. And then also in that regard, performance reviews. And so often, so many different organizations have different performance review processes, but I would certainly encourage anonymous reviews that allow for people to really give blunt and critical feedback to the individuals, and they may not know who it's coming from, and that's fine. But at least it's somebody telling the toxic leader, what they're seeing and how they are coming across to other people. Because a lot of times the toxic leader doesn't even know how they're affecting other people. And then also 360-degree reviews. I know that recently there's been some degradation of use of them, or seeing them as a best practice. But I think you can still incorporate 360 reviews in a way that maybe even combining it with anonymous, just so that you're getting the feedback of all the people around you. And maybe even random. It doesn't have to be every single person, but you get a lottery of who's reporting on who's doing a performance review on who. So you're getting more of a random and independent feedback on how you are coming across as a leader.
I love that last point, as far as the number 3, as far as, guarding yourself, or defenses you can put, is hiring a coach. One of the areas, especially in emergency management or government, I should say, not necessarily EM, but EM is what I work in the most. So, and they're the people I deal with the most. And so I study business, and I study these very successful businesses, these big organizations, and they have all of what you just mentioned in these three defenses. They have barriers to get in. They have the core values, that their vision, their very clear vision, their core values that they stand on. They have, they're very cognizant of guarding that door, who they let in. They want the best people in their organization to help make them money. And I think, and it's not so much the money that counts, it's the being a better service to their customer, which brings them more money. And then they hire professional coaches. And one of the things that I find when I talk about this topic is, if it's not free, most of the emergency managers will not do it. Right. Whether it's a class or whether it's a coach or whether it's whatever, right? If it's not grant funded or their job's not going to pay for it, it's not going to be done. Yep. And I love that mentality of being able to point that out, because of the most successful businesses in the world, these are the things that they do. And it boils down to what you do as an individual. I pay for coaches constantly. I got mentors, I got coaches. I talk to people. I get that feedback from not only the people that I work closest with, but those that are extended away. That people that come to these events that we do, the Theory and Practice monthly meetings that we have, to see, what do you want? What do you need? What can I do better? Because ultimately, that's what it is. If I do it better, that means I'm going to be able to retain that individual to be able to come to the meetings and come to the learning. So what is it that we can do? I mean, one of the things that I love about, your incorporation of the toxic leadership approach, but also the business approach. And I know you offer coaching through Leaders Intent, which is amazing. How do we incorporate these things where it doesn't seem like it's costing us anything?
Yeah, well, and I think one answer to that is, first and foremost, the mentorship. I mean, I see a lot of people on the call today that are just absolute friends of mine that I love and adore. And if they've ever worked for me, they know that there is an open door, that they can reach out to me anytime, and I'm there for them to talk about what they're going through and help them deal with it could be an emergency management issue, it could be a leadership issue, it could be whatever, it could be a more personal issue. But that being said, and that mentorship, is free. And so, and so encouraging that within the workplace, and or even having a more formal workplace environment where or a more formal mentorship program in place in larger organizations, that sort of thing can be helpful in selecting that. But even again, like you said, it has to be free, or at least and also I think easy. And I really have huge amount of respect for Chief Chris Donovan, who I work for at El Segundo. And he had a contract in place for all the firefighters with a coaching company that was accessible. And some people took advantage of it, some people didn't. But the fact that it was there and available, I thought that was amazing, and was an amazing move on his part to make things easy and accessible to such coaching. So there's certainly that aspect of it as well. So it doesn't have to be anything elaborate or whatever, and it can be done with a little bit of amount of effort and work, but not really cost the organization or the individual a lot of money. But an interesting note though, you talk about the cost and these things, but just think how much money we would have available for such things if we weren't going down the toxic leadership road in the first place and taking the hit on the legal fees and the higher health care and the lower productivity and so on and so forth. Your budget, should increase significantly when you get rid of the toxicity out of the organization, and that should free up money to help pay for some of these things that we're even talking about.
Yeah, and I know as we wind down here, I have one more question about that. But if you're on the call and you have a question, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. If you want to come off mute and ask the question, please raise your hand. If you want me to read the question, just put it in chat. But this last question I have, and it's not really a question, it's more of a wanting to gain some of your insight on. So as I mentioned, there's these the most successful organizations out there. They do all the things that you said as it relates to defending against the toxic leadership. How do we implement that to the best of our ability when it comes to, especially emergency management or government, right? When we're dealing with government, and you deal with the application process, and it is an interview process, and you think, well, we're going to do a personality test, and like, what am I going to do? And there's just so many things that these very successful, that basically weeding out of the toxic framework, really. And you're gaining the best up. We want the best emergency managers. We want the best firefighters and law enforcement. We want the best. So there's to do that, and ultimately firefighting and law enforcement, you have to do those things. Mm-hmm. You have to do the psychological exams and the personality traits, and you got to do those. You got to go through probation. You got to do all these things. But as in government, we don't really see that as much. And I know that that's where we struggle in emergency management, is the professionalization of it. How do we get to that? Like, what is it that we can do, the 28 of us that are on this call, the 30 of us that are on this call, to say, these are things I can do to help towards that direction?
Yeah, well, that's a tough question, Dan. As you know, getting to where we want in emergency management, that's what our frame organization's all about, and that sort of thing. But and I know we're winding down, not winding up, because I could go on and on there. And I would also say, how can we afford to do these best practices that we mentioned? And I have a kind of a different response to that, and that's, how can you afford not to? I mean, oh my gosh, when we're talking about an organization that is responsible for the lives, livelihood, and quality of life for the people that they represent, how can you afford, with the stakes so high and the risk portfolio so large, how can you afford not to do these best practices? But really getting back to your question, and not to dodge it, how do we change and implement this kind of thing? And again, I still think it comes back to a better understanding of what we're looking for in terms of employees, because so often, we look at the job description, which again probably hasn't been updated in 20 years or whatever, or since it was ever created. and didn't include leadership traits and that sort of thing. But let's make sure that what we're looking for is valued, that the leadership is valued every bit as much, if not more, than the technical aspects of it. So, okay, you don't have, I personally think, I like more raw people coming into my sphere, because I can teach them emergency management. I can't, what I can't do is really do a lot of changing in terms of their leadership aspects, because a lot of that was formed in their youth. And so finding those big fits and ensuring that you're seeking the leaders that you need to move your organization, not seeking the emergency managers that you need to move your organization. I think that's one of the big keys to helping emergency management move forward.
Yeah, I agree I mean, I think it boils down to how much you're willing to invest in an individual, how much training, how much time, and are you really to really nurture those skills of leadership? Are you willing to? I mean, you can teach emergency management. You can teach leadership as well. You got to nurture it though. I mean, it's a skill that's learned, that's honed. It is a use it or lose it, just like most of what's in EM, right? And that's one of the reasons why I love emergency management and leadership so much. They're so proactive, or at least they're supposed to be.
Yeah.
If you're proactively approaching emergency management, proactively approaching leadership, then you're actively looking to do the things you need to do well, and to be of service of others. So that's one of the reasons why I love leadership and emergency management so well. It's one of the reasons why I want to see it grow. It's why I want to see the individuals grow. And I love the approach that you've taken with kind of the negative approach of looking at leadership. The negativity, if you don't do these things, this is what's going to happen. Like it's going to be negative. It's going to be toxic. It's going to cost you all this money. And I think that ultimately too, it would actually, just like an emergency manager trying to sell prevention and mitigation, right? It's going to, ultimately, how do you prove financially that by doing these things, it's going to save you in the long run, right? We got to learn how to do that better as individuals to be able to sell our programs, to sell ourselves, to sell our teams, to sell whatever it is. Spending money, right? That doesn't necessarily show anything right away. That's a big thing when it comes to leadership as well. You may be investing in someone and something or an organization, and the little things all individually, they don't matter at all. But you bring them all together and they matter a great deal.
Yeah.
And they show over time, right? So I love that. So thank you so much for taking the time to come answer questions, have this discussion. But I'll leave it the last word to you to if you have any final thoughts or notes before I close out. I'm not seeing anybody raise their hand I got one thing in chat, so let me look at that. But I'll leave the final, if you have any last thing you'd like to say before we jump off.
Well, I really like what you said about the development, and I truly believe that is one of, I mean, I've seen some research where they talk about zero tolerance policy, and I just don't know how that's effective, because as I mentioned, we all have good days and bad days, and we're going to experience, or we're going to demonstrate some level of toxic leadership from time to time. And so you can't just say, oh, well, he micromanaged me today, and so out he goes, or anything like that. But so we can't have that zero tolerance policy. But again, it comes back to that self-awareness and that continuous development. And readers are leaders. You have all access to all kinds of leadership books and so forth. You have, again, the mentors, and the focus on personal development and taking care of the employees that are in your charge. That's where we're at, and that's what's going to make your organization the most effective that it is. And how scary is it when we talk about an emergency management organization that is again responsible for the lives of people before, during, and after disasters and that sort of thing? How functional would an organization be if they have 15% of their workforce, only 15% of their workforce fully engaged, and if they have another 30% of the employees who leave within 2 years, and 58% that leave in 5 years, and having that turnover and the impacts that the turnover has? And then on top of that, you're getting the loss of production, the 48% less productive people in toxic leadership environments. That does not sound like a very good organization that I want looking out for me and my family before, during, and after a disaster. And so that's the importance of combating this toxic leadership. And that's why I hope people will take these lessons to heart and seek out ways to stamp out the disease from their organization.
Well, I appreciate it very much, and this conversation we've had them multiple times individually. I love that we were able to bring it together and for others to see it, and we're recording this so others even more potentially see or revisit it later. For those who are wondering, so this is being recorded. I will be sending out the link for the recording, and for those who didn't get to come could potentially see that as well. One thing though, I like to link with emergency management leadership, and I put them together pretty heavily in what I do, is that they're both industries of service. Like leadership is, you are taking those traits of leadership and you're being proactive. Emergency management is supposed to be proactive, and they both involve taking care of other people.
Yeah.
Emergency management just does it at such a larger scale. And if you can't do it one-on-one, you definitely can't do it at a larger scale. So it's one of those things that we're people of service. We don't do this job necessarily for recognition. We do it so we can take care of others, so we can actually serve others. And as you mentioned, the things that we do or don't do affect people's lives, their livelihood, and the properties and environments in which the communities that we are supposed to be serving. So having these two traits of leadership and practicing emergency management, are that proactivity that goes along with how you do everything day to day, is huge. And I appreciate you sharing that with us. I appreciate you sharing your points of view. Thank you for answering the questions, and thank you for taking the time. And time is your most valuable resource, and I appreciate you giving me some of that today and everybody else on the call. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me. And if anybody needs to contact me, you can find me on LinkedIn and that sort of thing. But please feel free to reach out. Happy to answer any other questions or track down. I know we kind of talked about data and reports and that sort of thing, and happy to cite the work that we were referring to and that sort of thing if you want that.
Yeah, and awesome. For all those who are listening, when I do post this, you'll be able to, I'll also attach a link to Randy's profile so you can reach out to him. And we are, Randy is on LinkedIn, he's on Facebook, and ultimately Frame, the foundation that we're basically trying to build up to promote and advance the emergency management, not only profession, but the professionals that are going to be doing the work. So you'll be hearing more from us on Frame, but that was created by Randy. So Randy, thank you so much. I'm going to hit the stop button here, and then for all those who would like to stick around and have a conversation, please do so.